This presentation discusses the prominent role the Genealogical Society of Utah played in the 1920s through the 1940s in spreading and maintaining teachings within the LDS Church regarding blessings and curses that were said to be inherited due to a person's ancestral lineage. The two most prominent of these teachings were, first, that the great majority of the saints with a European background were literally Israelites, most from the, quote, blood of Ephraim. This was thought to be of essential eternal importance because they believed God had uniquely chosen and blessed the children of the Old Testament patriarch Israel. The second of the salient lineage teachings was that people with black African ancestry had a cursed lineage that significantly limited their access to the blessings of the church and heaven. Why does the role of the Genealogical Society of Utah in spreading, reinforcing, and in some instances creating these teachings matter? I argue that the lineage lessons produced by the Genealogical Society, and especially by longtime society leader Joseph Fielding Smith, during this time period had a key, even necessary role in sustaining and prolonging the Church's lineage-based teachings and policies. Before and after this era, genealogy lessons produced by the Church focused on research techniques and doctrines other than lineage-based blessings and curses. Without first, the lineage lessons produced in the 1920s through the 40s, and particularly from 1931 through about 1942, and second, the Society's impressive church-wide infrastructure and teaching programs that ensured church members read and absorbed the Society's lesson content in those years and ensuing decades. Without those two items, I think a reasonable case can be made that the restrictions on people with black African ancestry would have ended decades sooner. And I think our creation of a favored Ephraimite identity for saints with a European background would have waned long ago. As to the latter, beliefs in a Mormon Israelism are declining now and have been for about 30 years. But without the Society's prodigious teaching efforts, which you are about to see, Mormon Israelism likely would have faded 100 years ago. My name is Stirling Adams. If you are listening to this in an audio-only file without the accompanying video on the Dialogue website, please be aware the audio refers to some information shown only on the slides. This slide shows the table of contents and at what minute an item occurs in the presentation. For someone listening on audio only, the presentation has two main sections. The first describes the Society's organization and teaching programs in the 1920s into the 1940s, a machine that demanded time commitments from members and had a local and church-wide influence unlike anything seen in the church before or since. The second section explores lineage-focused doctrinal teachings produced by the Society and used as lesson texts, and shows how these teachings were inculcated among church members. After a conclusion, a minor section follows that explores some questions and areas for further exploration that are beyond the scope of this presentation. Let's start. Within the LDS Church, it's rare that a doctrine or policy is created with a single pronouncement or with a series of statements, even when made by prophets or apostles, or even sometimes when set out in scriptures. For doctrines to take hold, to have staying power, they often need to be nourished by many complementary actions and teachings and repeatedly nurtured over time, often over decades. Think of how the patriarchal order has changed in concept and emphasis. Consider the rise and fall of spiritual adoptions, the ebbs and flows in second anointings, the changes to our millenarianism and apocalyptic views, of the disappearance of speaking in tongues and women giving healing blessings. In the 1850s, Brigham Young taught the concept of blood atonement, as did, in the next several decades, other early leaders, including Charles Penrose and John Taylor. Apostles Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie preached this well past the mid-20th century. Smith summarized the concept as, quote, "Man may commit certain grievous sins that will place him beyond the reach of the atoning blood of Christ. If then he would be saved, he must sacrifice his own life to atone for that sin." But this teaching has little theological foothold in the church today. Except oddly, in the 1992 Encyclopedia of Mormonism, there's an article on blood atonement written by a former church general authority that describes the doctrine as a current teaching. Blood atonement was ugly theology through and through, but but its theological opposites also withered without continued nurturing. For example, the concept of eternal progression, the forever possibility of continued moral and intellectual growth, was planted by some church leaders, including one Joseph Smith. It was nourished, taught, and retaught for decades, then strangled. And, germane to our topic today, off the top of my head, I could name a dozen scriptures that teach that God is no respecter of persons, that all are like unto God, that Christ united Jew and Gentile and, quote, hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, and that therefore we are, quote, no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens as saints. In a few minutes, 2 or 3 of us could easily list a few dozen such verses. But tragically, our history shows that the frequent repetition of this teaching in Scripture was not enough to establish within the church a belief, a practice, that God was in fact no respecter of persons, or that we all are fellow citizens before God. When it comes to Mormon concepts of lineage and that very constructed thing called race, and of ancient tribal blessings and cursings of a jealous, angry God that favored an epically sinful tribe, and when it comes to Mormons defining themselves to be literal descendants of that tribe, legal heirs to presumably amazing blessings, all this too was a belief system that didn't happen in an instant, a year, or 2 decades, or 5. This and the following slides summarize what came to be some of the main lineage teachings in Mormonism. First, God chose Israel's descendants as his favored tribe. Descendants of grandson Ephraim were especially favored. Those special blessings apply to the tribe even today. Then, the lost tribes of Israel were the principal settlers of Europe and the British Isles, and then were scattered throughout the world. Almost all who joined the restored church were thought to be literal Israelites, most with predominantly the blood of Ephraim, and many were considered to have the pure blood of Ephraim. Next, male saints were legally entitled, or heirs by birthright, to the priesthood because of their Israelite lineage. Descendants of Cain or Ham were said to have been cursed to be slaves and could not access the temple or priesthood blessings. People with black skin were wrongly presumed to be those descendants. Lineage was thought to be determined by one's pre-earth behavior and expected to significantly shape one's behavior on earth. And then, depending on the decade and the person preaching, there was more or less emphasis on the teaching that some, not all, some people who were not literal descendants of Israel could be adopted into the tribe upon joining the church. In a manner difficult today to fathom, for mid-20th century Mormons, because of the prevalence of these teachings, one's literal blood lineage, and usually an imagined literal lineage, was extraordinarily, eternally important. We know quite a bit about how and by whom those ideas were first articulated in our church and how they initially developed into formal teachings and practices in the 1800s. But, given these concepts were a direct rejection of the post-tribal message of the New Testament, and because they required huge imaginative leaps of conspiratorial history to even come close to reaching plausible ground, how were they maintained into and through most of the 20th century, and even, to some degree, into the 21st century up to today? My thesis is that because there were so many historical, logical, biological, mathematical, and theological flaws buttressing our lineage beliefs, they could only have continued to flourish or even survive if they received consistent nurturing over time. As background, of the many flaws, consider now just these 2. In the Joseph Smith period of the church, temple and priesthood privileges were not limited by lineage. In both the New Testament and Book of Mormon churches, none of church membership, divine blessings, and priesthood were restricted based on lineage. The author of Hebrews expressly taught that the Melchizedek priesthood was, quote, without father, without mother, without descent. Even the Old Testament contains multiple examples of the priesthood being passed without consideration of lineage. Speaking of the Old Testament, many mid-20th century Mormons, along with other American Christians, more so those in the former slave states, simply misread our Old Testament stories when interpreting them as justifying, even mandating racial segregation and prohibiting miscegenation. Our misreading occurred because we forced onto the Old Testament our American obsession with skin color. But as Peter Murray points out, quote, In ancient Israel, religion, not race, was the basis of the prohibition against intermarriage, since Jews and other peoples of the region were all Semitic. Then, the second point on this slide, these very same blessed ancient Israelites came to be the most cursed people on earth. We Latter-day Israelites completely ignored Deuteronomy 28, where for disobedience, in 49 long verses, God curses all of Israel that they and their heirs will be, as summarized in the chapter heading, quote, smitten and destroyed, that diseases, plagues, and oppression will come upon them, that fierce nations will enslave them, they will eat their own children and be scattered among all nations. And that's the safe for public description. The curses are worse than anything said on Cain, Ham, the Egyptians, on any other people. Would these curses, over 80 in all, be removed, perhaps in our time? No. They end with, quote, these curses shall pursue thee till thou be destroyed, and they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. We ignored these curses heaped on the Israelites, or at the very least allowed them to be superseded by time. But despite the central events and teachings described in the New Testament, we didn't allow the same courtesy to other peoples we imagined to be subject to much less severe curses. A note on the origin of our Israelism teachings, which, among other reasons they are striking, stand out because the earliest Mormons viewed themselves as Gentiles, expressly not Israelites. One of the chief callings they assumed was the gathering of other peoples who were Israelites. It's easy to see now, and justifiably criticize, how Mormon Israelism was a significant departure from the teachings of Scripture. In this presentation I do that. But putting aside for a moment the influences of the racism inherent in European colonialism and an American culture and economy built on slavery and the violent theft of native lands, what were some of the well-intentioned reasons behind the development of Mormon Israelism? To flesh this question out a little more, here we are in the early 21st century with a much greater knowledge of human migrations, biology, and the history of the development of our own theology and practices regarding lineage, ethnicity, and race. It can be tempting and too easy when looking at the mistakes of a prior era to ignore or fail to understand the well-intentioned motives of our forebears. What were those motives, and how might understanding them better help us to productively examine our own current beliefs and practices? There are many good works exploring precisely these questions, and there are multiple complex answers. These questions are spacious enough that there is room for more analysis, but in another forum. This presentation focuses instead on the machinery and details of how the Israelism teachings were extended into the 20th century. But in passing, I note that the text highlighted in red here shows some of the motives that are more clearly seen in the lesson manuals of the Genealogical Society that we'll look at. And I'll just introduce the second one listed. In some ways, the early Mormons were primitivists, not just New Testament primitivists, meaning they were trying to restore the religious culture displayed by Christians in the New Testament, but significantly, they were also Old Testament primitivists. And we, were putting great effort into literally restoring the culture and institutions of the people of the Old Testament. As some examples, this included literally placing the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve in northwest Missouri, and building and using temples in what they believed was an Old Testament manner. And it included gradually coming to define themselves as the literal and sometimes principal and most pure, most direct descendants of the Israelites. It seems that it became easier and more useful to define themselves as Israelites after they lived through what they felt was a Moses-like exodus when fleeing the United States in the late 1840s, and then, over several decades, in another recreation of Old Testament behavior as they took the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone lands of the Colorado Plateau. Let's now explore what the Genealogical Society was. Because the early Mormon saints were not, in fact, descendants of Israel or Ephraim, any more than the rest of the world was, or any more than they were or we are descendants from a servant of Confucius or of an East African goat shepherdess or many, many other people living in Israel's time in various parts of the world, and because black Africans were not, in fact, the descendants from a Cain or Ham figure, for these things to be believed, support had to be conjured up and maintained from somewhere. and it was. In the first half of the 20th century, there was one church organization that, as the result of a period enthusiasm for the ideas of British Israelism, spread among us a transcontinental shipload of false royal genealogies, bloodline conspiracies, and an affinity for bad history. That was the Genealogical Society of Utah. Founded by the church in 1894 to promote genealogy and temple work, by 1910 it had gathered some institutional heft and started the quarterly Utah Genealogical and Historical magazine, which ran from 1910 through 1940 and published doctrinal essays, articles on genealogy research, and lesson content for church genealogy classes. This slide shows the full 30-year run, with some individual issues in the envelopes in which they were mailed to subscribers, and many issues bound in volumes for archiving in a personal or institutional library. The magazine's text was printed in a small 8-point font. The quarterly issues were generally 50 pages long. A small number were larger. One exceeded 140 pages. One of the features that distinguished the society was the content it produced to justify claims of the saints' Israelite lineage, claims that can be seen now as untethered from conventional notions of history. This is where Odin and Thor, yes, that Odin, also known as the Allfather, the ruler of heaven, the father of hosts, the first husband of Frigg, the battle god, and that Thor, Thor the bear, Thor the terrible, Thor the god of thunder, take a break from Asgard to perch on a branch of many Mormon family trees. Much of the history we taught ourselves was copied directly from the wild-eyed Protestant British Israelism movement. We'll look into that. This content shaped how we set our pasty white European selves up on a pedestal and created support for a framework that made possible our continuing exclusion of people with black African ancestry. But first, what also made the society stand out was that it was a marvel of organizational and pedagogical efficiency, with a huge stake and ward-level infrastructure much larger than any church organization today. Consider some examples of how it spread its messages. Let's start with the meteoric growth of the local genealogy organization. In 1907, Susie Young Gates, leader of the Society's Women's Committee, organized the first LDS genealogy class. A group met weekly in the Salt Lake City Lion House. Class members heard doctrinal lectures from church leaders and learned research techniques. Beginning in 1911, for several years, the magazine published a regular lesson on genealogy research techniques or concepts that was written by Gates. In 1913, Gates began traveling to Utah stakes, including to St. George, to present a 6-lesson genealogy course. In 1918, the Society announced in the magazine that each ward should offer a genealogy class once a month, and that one person from each stake and another from each ward be designated as the genealogy representative to oversee the instruction. One person, once a month. That's about the number of genealogy representatives at my ward and stake level now, about 100 years later in 2019. But the Society was in growth mode. In 1921, the Society tasked each stake and ward with creating a genealogy committee of 5 people. Each committee should have a chairman and, quote, 2 brethren and 2 sisters to assist him, end quote. The stake committee was supposed to meet not less than monthly. Ward committees were supposed to meet weekly. The size of the committees and their domain continued to grow. Over the years, the magazine provided more and more instruction on the role of the committees. By 1934 and 35, there was a year-long series of 40 lessons called Church Service on Genealogical Committees. It was published in installments in the magazine and separately in booklets. The first 10 lessons fell under the heading of Efficient Genealogical Organizations. The second taught skills for effective genealogy home teaching. Lessons 21 through 30 focused on teaching methods for genealogy classes. By the mid-1930s, each committee was supposed to include all of a director and 2 counselors, a secretary, and subcommittees for each of senior classes, junior classes, home teaching, finances, socials, magazine and membership subscriptions, endowments, sealings, baptisms, temple projects, and family organization. And for a time, a committee for the Church Temple Security Project. This organization chart shows the recommended structure for each of the ward and stake committees. As a slight digression, what was the Church Temple Security Project? In the Society manual called Teaching One Another, In the lesson designated for Monday, March 18, 1940, the Temple Security Project was explained as, quote, a means by which every individual in the whole church is given a full opportunity to be active in temple work. Genealogical home teachers will be provided with receipt books in triplicate. They should visit every home and invite each family to contribute either in cash or in produce towards having temple ordinances administered for their kindred. In the lesson manual, the recommended size for the Alberta Canada State Committee was 29 members. This photo of a Pasadena State Committee shows 12. And remember, each ward in the stake was supposed to also have its own full committee. The magazine provided reports, stake by stake, of committee results. To pick an example from the April 1932 report, we see that the Ensign Stake in Salt Lake had 19 members on its stake committee. In the previous quarter, the committee held 13 meetings, and there were 3 stake union meetings of the stake committees together with ward committees. There were 47 ward committee meetings, 87 visits by stake committees to wards, 1,341 visits by ward committees to homes for genealogical home teaching, and 87 genealogical classes. During the last quarter of 1937, this Ensign stake reported that of 3,070 families in the stake, 1,140 were active in genealogical research, 8 wards were holding senior genealogy classes, and 3 were holding junior classes. Did people attend these classes? This photo of a 1930s Liberty Park Ward senior genealogy class shows 62 adults. Let's continue with genealogy classes. Susie Young Gates and the Society's Women's Committee started producing lesson content in about 1911. After sustained pressure from the Genealogical Society and following placement of Gates on the Relief Society board, the Relief Society also got religion on Lineage. From about 1914 through 1922, once a month, the Relief Society held a genealogy lesson. Lesson outlines were published in the monthly Relief Society magazine. An example shown here is the lesson for September 1914. A 1916 Genealogical Society magazine article portrays the Women's Committee, together with the Relief Society, as taking the lead in organizing genealogy classes and work up to that time. Gates led the Relief Society in also sponsoring both a 3-day church-wide genealogy conference and genealogy sessions during General Conference. And Gates and the Relief Society developed coursework with the Genealogical Society, including the 600-page 1918 book compiled by Gates called Surname Book and Racial History that was used in both organizations' classes and was marketed to genealogical organizations outside of Utah. As you see here, some of the chapter titles are Ham's Descendants, Disobedient Races Descended from Shem, Racial Beginnings in Europe, and Where the Races and Tribes Settled in Europe. In the early 1920s, the Relief Society's direct involvement in creating genealogy content and organizing conferences diminished as the growing Genealogical Society took over control of both of those areas. The Relief Society settled into a status as consumer of genealogy content. The genealogy conferences started by the Women's Committee in the mid-19-teens became a church-wide institution in the 1920s and 30s. Following instructions from the Genealogical Society, annual genealogy conventions were held at stake, regional, and church-wide levels, at least in Utah, Arizona, Idaho, California, Canada, and Germany. In 1930, there were 60 regional conventions. In 1935, there were 79. Typically, 2 or more people from society headquarters would participate in the conventions. The conventions often spanned multiple days. This 1922 photo is of over 100 people that attended a week-long tri-state convention in Canada for the McGrath, Taylor, and Lethbridge stakes. At the Society's urging, lineage-themed plays and pageants were written and produced at both local and church-wide levels. The Society and Deseret Book marketed scripts for genealogy plays and pageants. Some wards wrote and performed their own works. These photos are from the 1932 pageant George Washington's Birthright, performed both at the Tabernacle and Assembly Hall. Each ward was encouraged to perform this pageant on the 5th Sunday of May, 1933. Importantly, in this era, genealogy committees were assigned to organize and present the content for the Sunday program for wards on 5th Sundays. And in the 1940s, in some stakes, genealogical committees presented ward programs on the Sunday evenings of stake conferences. Committees also held special meetings for the ward on fast Sunday evenings. In 1919, the Society had 2 full-time employees. By 1933, this large building was constructed in downtown Salt Lake to house the Society's archives and staff. By 1944, it employed 100 people and was all of a publishing house, a center for curriculum development, a large library, and a research center. Society employees performed outreach, training, and research throughout the church. It was, in then Society President Joseph Fielding Smith's view, not an auxiliary. As he had admonished in Idaho Genealogy Convention, quote, "The Society is not an auxiliary. Get that firmly fixed in your minds. The Sunday School, Primary, Religion Class, Mutual, and Relief Society, these are auxiliary organizations. But this organization has a place which is unique, which is absolutely necessary in this church and kingdom." This photo shows the 22 employees of the Society's 1939 Research Department. 21 of the employees, including the supervisor, are women. Of the 20-plus photos in the Society's 1938 manual titled Teaching One Another, the large majority of people shown performing genealogy work are women, including about 80% of people shown as employees of the Society. The largest photo on this slide, entitled The Home Teachers Called, shows 2 female home teachers presenting a lesson to a family. Great effort was spent reaching youth with the Lineage programs. A representative article in 1932 reminded readers the church had assigned the Society to teach all members of every age. It encouraged them to assist in the monthly genealogy lessons already taught in the lesser priesthood classes, and if they didn't exist, to start weekly classes and activities for younger boys and girls. Junior genealogy classes were held for use as young as 11, and depending on the number of youth in a ward and their appetite for genealogy, there might be up to 3 different junior classes covering different age groups. Here's a photo of a 1939 junior class in an Ogden ward. As a normal feature of the genealogy classes, youth and adults were assigned to write essays on class topics. They were asked to collect assignments and the results of their genealogy research in a book of remembrance that each class member was asked to purchase. The magazine would occasionally publish an essay by a junior member. An example assignment is found in Lesson 44 of Proving Your Pedigree, a year-long course for the Sunday schools. Shown at the bottom right here, class members are tasked with, quote, "Write a paper on the topic, My Heritage and Mission as a Descendant of Ephraim." This complements the objective for that week's lesson, which is shown at the top right. Quote, "Since we are by revelation declared to be of Israel, present facts regarding our pedigree from Adam to Ephraim with scriptural proofs." Throughout much of the 1930s and 40s, Monday night was formally designated by the church as the night for, not family home evening, for genealogy classes led by the Society. In fact, in 1936, a stake president who tried to set aside Monday as a home night for families was kindly rebuked and advised that the church was moving towards designating a Saturday home night for families. As one data point from the 1937 Cache, Utah stake, its periodic report showed enrollment in Monday genealogy classes of about 260 people, with a 70% attendance rate, mostly from young people aged 16 to 25. Classes on Monday nights were recommended to be held from 7:30 to 9 p.m. The ward genealogy committees were encouraged to meet after the regular class had finished. The 4th Monday of each night was home teaching night, that is, genealogy home teaching night. The ward genealogy committee was tasked with visiting, 2 by 2, each family in the ward to give lineage lessons or assist in research. And by each family, that meant every single family in the ward. This effort was taken seriously. The Society produced books and many lessons on how to best carry out home teaching. The January 35 magazine contained 30 pages of lessons on the art of home teaching, including lessons entitled Hints from Successful Salesmen and Methods of Tactful Teachers, and 2 15 to 20-minute scripts for plays to practice home teaching. In one of those, a father and son marvel at the wonderful plan of the German government of requesting every German citizen to establish his pedigree chart to prove his Aryan racial descent. As a side note, with hindsight, a painful side note, this play relied on a lengthy article written by Society staff in the April 1934 magazine, titled Search for Ancestors in Light of the German Racial Movement. It had a tone of breathless excitement in finding kindred spirits in Germany, reporting of great events and men of vision leading to the new Nazi government's sponsorship of racial research and a just-announced requirement for citizens to produce a pedigree chart. The article quoted extensively from a recent speech by a German government official with the title of Cabinet Minister for Racial History, and approvingly shared a separate German government proclamation that stated, "It has become a necessity that every German citizen, backed by scientifically trained and organized societies, must compile his family record and history, and this has to be accomplished in a very brief period of time." And the commendable work done for decades by the various genealogical and heraldic societies will now be a basis for the solutions of problems in national scientific and political endeavors. That was in the Society magazine in April 1934, when the intentions of the Nazi government toward Jews were much less clear than in late 1938. On November 9th and 10th of 1938, the widespread pogrom attacking German Jews in what came to be known as Kristallnacht was carried out. This was reported on widely in the Utah press. These are some of the articles published on either page 1 or 2 of the Salt Lake Telegram in the week after the pogrom. Yet, 2 months after Kristallnacht, in the January 1939 magazine, the Society published an article entitled German Service to Genealogy. This article exuded the same unabashed enthusiasm for Germany's racial policies. Some excerpts from the article are, "The German government is making many valuable contributions to this work of the Lord," and "The newspaper men have caught the spirit of this and foster the work by writing articles regularly in special sections. Even the radio is brought into action. Each Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. a national broadcast is given." And "Every school child must take a course in the preparation and preservation of the family history." The article finishes with, "How blessed and privileged are the Latter-day Saints! A mighty nation doth serve us well in this our glorious mission." That's the end of this digression, but I comment in passing that the magazine's 30-year lifespan ended in 1941, when it was given a regular and relatively small section in the more general-purpose church magazine, The Improvement Era. And though, as we'll see in the next section of this presentation, the Society's Israelism continued towards a high point in the early 1940s, it did noticeably flag by the late 1940s. It could be that Germany's example of how an emphasis on lineage and lineal purity can go terribly wrong changed how some in the church thought about our own extreme emphasis on lineage, and it may have given support to those in leadership positions who were either unenthusiastic about our Israelism, of which it seems there were many, or plainly disagreed with the lineage teachings, of which there were at least some. In the 1930s, society leaders worried that their teaching efforts weren't reaching enough church members because not all members attended genealogy classes. They asked the Sunday school to adopt a repeating multi-year genealogy curriculum. The directors of the Sunday school board refused. Joseph Fielding Smith, then an apostle and president of the society, managed to achieve what seems to be a mildly hostile political merger, as 4 officers of the Genealogical Society, including Joseph Fielding Smith himself, were placed on the Sunday school board. With that new leadership, the Sunday school assented to teaching genealogy lessons during its class time from 1 to 3 times a month. In the later 1930s and into the 40s, the society reached a point where classes it developed were being used throughout the church in all of junior and Sunday school genealogy classes, for the various Sunday school class age groups starting at age 8, for Relief Society, for College Institute, for priesthood quorums, for the weekday activities of the Young Men, Young Women's programs, for the M-Man and Gleaner programs, for seminary classes, and for classes taught at BYU and through its correspondence program. As an example, this lesson called A White and a Blessed People was in a priesthood manual published in the 1930s. The lesson was also used in one of the Society's lineage manuals. The Society also produced lineage content for weekly Deseret News articles, publications such as the Improvement Era and Relief Society magazine, general conference sermons, in radio firesides, musicals, in genealogy dances, in yearbooks, and pageants. So we see the Genealogical Society of Utah had the machinery to effectively spread lineage teachings among church members. And so it did. Through a decades-long steady stream of lessons, sermons, and activities, if you were a Mormon born after 1880, especially if you were born between 1900 and 1930, you were taught many dozens of times in multiple venues and mediums that you were literally an Israelite, and as such particularly chosen and favored by God. Let's now look at the main lesson manuals through which the Society spread Mormon Israelism. The society had the blessing and support of church leadership, but following the initial energy of Susan Young Gates and the Women's Committee, it was largely through the drive of a young Joseph Fielding Smith that it flourished, and the society became, in important ways, his doctrinal mouthpiece. Smith started working with the society in 1901. He became the secretary in 1907, then librarian and treasurer. He was its vice president from 1925 to 1934 and president from 1934 to 61. During much of this same time, he was also the head church historian and recorder and an apostle, and starting in 1951, he was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He was either the magazine's associate or chief editor from its beginning in 1910 through most of its tenure through 1940. He was the society's most prolific and prominent author of content, particularly of teachings of Israelite identity and entitlements to blessings or curses. And when it came to teachings claiming curses on people of African descent, he was the society's only author. As measured by the volume of his writings on behalf of the society, by his work as magazine editor, by the society leadership positions he held for decades, 60 years, and according to the people who worked in the society with him, he was the society's driving force. Of the many books and articles he wrote for the society, the most prominent was his 1931 lesson manual, The Way to Perfection. Its 360 pages contained 49 chapters designed as the course material for a year and a half's worth of genealogy or gospel doctrine classes. Over the years, as the book was designated by the church as the text for new lesson cycles, it was printed at least 18 times in English. The reprint dates included 1935, 40, 43, 49, 51, 53, 56, 58, multiple times in the 60s and 70s, including 1978 with a final print version in 1984. Translations were published in at least Danish, Dutch, French, German, Portuguese, and Japanese. Outside the U.S., it appears to have been printed the most in Germany. As a contemporary side note, The Way to Perfection was also released by Deseret Book in Amazon's Kindle format in 2017. Deseret removed it from Amazon on May 9, 2018. The dates on this slide from 1978 or later are highlighted in red because, given that the church ended its exclusion of blacks in 1978, and given the book's teachings we're about to look at, it's striking that the book continued to be used. 13 of the book's chapters preach that lineage was a central characteristic defining one's relationship to God and key to one's prospects for enjoying God's fullest blessings. These were chapters such as Appointment of Lineage, Ephraim and His Blessings, and Ephraim in the Latter Days. The chapters The Seed of Cain and The Seed of Cain After the Flood argued that people of black African ancestry held multiple curses and could not hold the priesthood. This slide summarizes the book's main negative racial teachings. This book is the primary means through which these were spread among 20th century church members. Of the 8 teachings listed on this slide, I'll read just the last one. In Chapter 7 of the book, Appointment of Lineage, in a section entitled Choice Spirits Given the Favored Lineage, he wrote, quote, "Is it not a reasonable belief that the Lord would select the choice spirits to come through the better grades of nations? Moreover, is it not reasonable to believe that less worthy spirits would come through less favored lineage? Does this not account, in very large part, for the various grades of color and degrees of intelligences we find in the earth?" In addition to the book, class members or wards were also asked to purchase a separate 52-page study guide which contained lesson outlines and discussion questions. Or, for the original 1931-32 class cycle, the guide was available in installments in the quarterly magazine. On this slide on the right, we see how the outline for the chapter The Seed of Cain After the Flood involved students in analyzing the lesson content. Student analyses and answers to these questions were the type of information they were asked to store in their classroom workbooks. Here is a close-up from that same page. Outline section 5 summarizes that portion of the chapter's content with, quote, A. Cain's curse of perpetual servitude. B. No power can hinder its fulfillment. C. Great rulers and constructive leaders and thinkers not supplied by this race. D. Traditional tasks performed by this race. Because it gives one a good sense of how the lessons inculcated doctrinal claims by assigning the students to come up with proofs for the claims, I've listed tasks assigned under the heading Study Thoughts. The student is supposed to provide answers based on information contained in the associated book chapter. As you can see, one task is to, quote, Discuss the truth of the statement in the text that Cain became the father of an inferior race. Another is to, quote, name any great leaders this race has produced. Based on the content of the chapter, the student is not expected to find an answer for this last question. In the 20th century, until the 1958 publication of Bruce R. McConkie's book, Mormon Doctrine, The Way to Perfection was the only book written by a general authority that described the Church's exclusions of people with black African ancestry, and similarly, the only book that offered detailed justifications for the exclusions. McConkie was Smith's son-in-law, and as with many other topics in Mormon doctrine, its lineage content was largely a repetition of his father-in-law's teachings. The Way to Perfection was the only text formally used as a lesson manual that contained these teachings. The salient piece of information about the Way to Perfection is that it was a lesson manual and reprinted for that purpose over a dozen times, and so the entire organizational structure of the church led people to study and accept its teachings. Because of Smith's prominence as an apostle and church historian, and because of the number of times the book was reused as a lesson text, for decades to come, it and he were regarded as the church's primary resources on the attitude of the church and God towards people with black African ancestry. Smith and this book significantly shaped the view of other church members and leaders, including the George Albert Smith First Presidency, when in the late 1940s the church's racial exclusionary policies were called into question and the First Presidency reified and reinforced the exclusions. The Way to Perfection had chapters and sections such as the Law of Primogeniture, the Keys of Gathering, Legal Heirs, a Land of Inheritance, the Appointment of Lineage, Favored Lineage, Pre-assignment to Nation or Tribe, Joint Heirs with Christ, the Seed of Cain, the Curse Continued, Joseph's Birthright Blessings, Ephraim the Firstborn, Ephraim and his Blessings, the Covenant Race. This emphasis on being legally entitled to blessings by birthright, of being heirs by right to the kingdom of heaven, established a framework for viewing the blessings of the gospel of Jesus Christ the way people saw property rights and national citizenship rights. That is, if you are the heir by birthright to that lot on 700 South and State Street, you are legally entitled to it, and there are others who necessarily are not so entitled, and you can ethically and legally exclude them from the property. If by birth or other right you are entitled to citizenship of a nation, you enjoy certain benefits, blessings, perhaps the ability to vote, own property, hold government office, or reside or travel in the country. Someone who is not a citizen will not share the same benefits. I hypothesize that our heavy emphasis on legal entitlement to the priesthood and other religious blessings, including exaltation in the highest kingdom of heaven, created a theological framework, a legalist, property-based theological narrative that obscured more than through a glass darkly the central teachings of Christianity, and made it possible for us to make palatable, acceptable, that which was not, our exclusion of black Africans. Of course, we see now this was epically terrible theology, among other reasons, for its rejection of the central message of Christianity. This theological development substantially strangled the message of the early Mormons, one of exuberant invitation to the entire world, to every country, and expressly every people, into a more stingy, selective conversation where blessings in this life and the next were viewed as scarce resources, thus creating motivation to restrict access to those blessings to a large section of humanity. Depending on whether we're talking about the year 1850 or 1950, the restrictions exclude 100 or 200 million people living at any one time. In 1936, the Society published another lesson manual by Smith, The Progress of Man. This 500-page book was first used as a course textbook in 1936 and 37. It was republished in 40, 44, 50, 52, and 64. This book and its separate 76-page study guide weren't as lineage-focused as The Way to Perfection, and its lineage teachings were more muted and less numerous and crowing, but they were there. As you see on this slide, he taught the occurrence of racial degeneration, that there was a divinely chosen lineage and a cursed lineage. Beyond the sheer volume of the print editions of The Way to Perfection and The Progress of Man, it's important to emphasize that these weren't texts written by a church leader and published by Deseret Book for passive consumption, perhaps as gifts or bookshelf fillers. They were published in so many print editions because members needed them for upcoming lessons. The members read and studied the books and answered questions and wrote essays about their content, and they saved those essays because that's what the manuals directed them to do. As a personal example, one of my great-grandfathers recorded twice in his journal that he was reading The Progress of Man with his wife. He had been a life member of the Society since 1910. In January 1943, he wrote that he and his wife read a portion of The Progress of Man in the evening. On President's Day in February, he wrote, "Washington's birthday, national holiday. Most of the day I spent with my wife reading The Progress of Man by Joseph Fielding Smith." The Way to Perfection stood out from most other society publications in both its anti-black teachings and its restrictive salvation theology. As a slight digression, compared to most Mormons today, Smith had a relatively restrictive view of the principles of the atonement, repentance, and forgiveness, and taught that many sinners who repented, as in the story of the prodigal son, could be welcomed into, quote, salvation only to be servants, not to inherit exaltation as sons, close quote. He repeatedly taught that the only path to exaltation was to obey all the commandments. What Smith had in common with many other society authors was at least partial adoption, and for some, it was whole hog acceptance, of the wild alternative world history of Anglo or British Israelism. Anglo-Israelism was the belief that Northern Europeans were principally descended from Israelite tribes who migrated there after Assyria conquered Israel in the 8th century BC. This belief became noticeably more widespread in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A variant of this idea, called British Israelism, viewed the British Isles as populated principally by descendants of the tribe of Ephraim. Though Smith was sympathetic to the claims of British Israelism, unless he was the unnamed author of chapters in The Children of the Covenant and Birthright Blessings that we'll see shortly, and I think it's more likely Archibald Bennett was the author of those, Smith usually restrained himself to what might be called Mormon Israelism, a belief that almost all who joined the church were literal descendants of Israel. This was possibly, but not necessarily, because England or Europe were principally settled by Israelites. It could be because the 10 tribes of Israel were now scattered all over the earth, and people with a unique concentration of Israelite blood, wherever located, were the ones who happened to be attracted to the Mormon message. Prior to the Society, there was one text within Mormonism that prominently taught Anglo and British Israelism. George Reynolds was an original director of the Society when it was founded in 1894. Reynolds was one of the 7 presidents of the 70, had been secretary to Brigham Young from 1865 to Young's death, and worked as a secretary to the various first presidencies until near Reynolds' death in 1909. His book, Are We of Israel, was published in 1878 and at least in 1883, 1895, 1916, 1931, 1948, and 1952. It was used as a Sunday school text in the 20th century in at least 1916. I haven't verified if the other publication dates are tied to church lessons. Society authors, including Smith in The Way to Perfection, quoted or relied on the book occasionally. Are We of Israel was based on the writings of popular British Israel writers that answered the question with a strong yes. In the book, Reynolds restated a long list of legends about travels of Israel's lost 10 tribes and examined possible similarities between European cultures and the ancient Israelites to make the arguments that the saints were of Israelite descent. This quote from the book captures well the approach of Reynolds and many of the Israelism writers within Mormonism. Quote, it would be almost impossible to enumerate the likenesses that have been found between the habits, manners, customs, personal appearance of the Israelites and Anglo-Saxons. It may be observed, however, that some of their identifications are very remarkable, while others are puerile and would be advanced by none but zealots. One of Reynolds' 32 children married Joseph Fielding Smith, and Reynolds appeared to have directly affected Smith's lineage thinking. Reynolds' specific claims in 1868 of dark-skinned peoples having degenerated from light-skinned ancestors due to sin are closely repeated in Joseph Fielding Smith's The Way to Perfection, The Progress of Man, and Doctrines of Salvation, and in the writings of Smith's son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, in his book, Mormon Doctrine. From 1910 up to 1920, the Society's magazine only occasionally carried teachings of literal Israelite lineage. Many issues had no statements supporting a claim that the Mormons were literal Israelites. The most such statements occurred in 1916 and 1917, where for the entire year's worth of magazine issues, there was a total of 4 and 5 claims, respectively. This began to change in the early 20s, when in the years 1920 through 1923, there were 7, 3, 3, and 9 claims, respectively. But then, in the later 20s, and much more so in the early 1930s and into the 40s, there was an explosion of Mormon Israelism claims. These came as the Society produced more and more lesson manuals that contained significant lineage content. It became common for an individual magazine or lesson manual to contain many, sometimes dozens, of Israelism and specifically Ephraimite claims. Beyond the works by Joseph Fielding Smith, the following are the other main lesson manuals published by the Society that contain claims of Mormon Israelism. These books don't carry an author's name, though I'm trying to determine authorship through indirect means and Society records. The Society also published other books and manuals I don't describe here that were focused only on practical genealogy research methods. The book Our Lineage was published by the Society in 1933 and 1938. 10 of its 40 lessons were published as a group under the category The Story of Our Race, the next 10 under Our Honorable Parentage. The remaining 20 dealt with technical research skills and less lineage-focused doctrines. Of the 40 lessons in the 1937 Children of the Covenant, about 6 focus on British Israelism teachings, with chapters such as Ancient Irish Pedigrees, Who are the Anglo-Saxons, Early Welsh Customs, and Teutonic Tribes. 6 teach Israelite origins for Pacific Islanders or peoples in the Americas, including Maori traditions and genealogies, our Indian brethren, and a white and a blessed people. This latter we saw was included in a manual for priests in the same decade. About 10 lessons center on teaching the youth they are of a chosen lineage and their attendant blessings and responsibilities. The manual called The Forefather Quest was published in 1937 and was a lesson book for third-year junior genealogy classes. About a third of its lessons focused on lineage doctrines. Power from on High was also published in 1937. It was a lesson manual for fourth-year junior genealogy classes. 7 of its 40 lessons contained Israelism teachings, including the lessons Priesthood and Lineage, Patriarchs and Patriarchal Blessings, The Gathering of Israel, Israel of the Last Days, and A Maori Prophet. In 1942, the Society prevailed on the Sunday School to adopt the 1 to 2 year course Birthright Blessings. The first 17 lessons focused on teaching saints they were of a chosen lineage, with specific responsibilities to carry out. They also recounted actions of heroic recent ancestors, recent as in since the Protestant Reformation. The remaining 31 lessons mostly presented the historical case that Israelites had settled the European lands from which the saints had migrated. Many of these lessons were adaptations, sometimes very close adaptations, of British Israelism publications. Lesson 1, Our Lineage and Mission, taught that the saints, quote, heritage is the best in the world. We come through a glorious lineage of noble men and women of highest character, and blessed are we because of our lineage through generations of patriarchs and prophets of ancient Israel. And, quote, spirits were assigned to be born into the chosen family of Israel because of their faithfulness in pre-existent life. Both lessons 1 and 2 taught class members they were entitled to the priesthood, quote, by right of birth. In lesson 2, the word of the Lord, the first section, A Race Deprived of the Priesthood, analyzes Abraham chapter 1 and Moses 8 and concludes, quote, clearly then, there is a lineage which cannot bear the priesthood, even though those of that descent live in righteousness. It does not identify what lineage that is. As an example of the Israelism lessons in the Birthright Blessings Manual, Lesson 25, The Mound Builders of Europe, presented, quote, proof from archaeology that Scandinavia, Russia, and Ukraine were settled by Israelites. The majority of the text consists of quotes from other works, including 3 British Israelism books from the late 1800s. I'll take the time to read the 3 titles here because they are very telling. 50 Reasons Why the Anglo-Saxons Are Israelites of the Lost Tribes of the House of Israel, published around 1890. Then, The Israelites found in the Anglo-Saxons, the 10 tribes supposed to have been lost, traced from the land of their captivity to their occupation of the Isles of the Sea, with an exhibition of those traits of character and national characteristics assigned to Israel in the books of the Hebrew prophets, published in 1872, and then Israel's Wanderings, or the Scots, the Saxons, and the Kimri, a connected account tracing the lost tribes of Israel. This was published in 1881 by the British Israel Identity Organization. These books and the Birthright Blessings Manual like Reynolds' book, Are We of Israel, called to mind the protagonist of Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, who was searching for evidence of a centuries-long conspiracy to control world power, and wrote that in rummaging through, quote, everything we could lay our hands on, encyclopedias, newspapers, cartoon strips, publishers' catalogs, luck rewarded us because, wanting connections, we found connections, always, everywhere, and between everything. The world exploded into a whirling network of kinships where everything pointed to everything else. Everything explained everything else. For our Anglo and British and Mormon Israelists, almost anything could prove literal descendancy from Israel's lost tribes. That there was evidence the Anglo-Saxons as a people were drunkards, and that the Anglo-Saxons had a reputation for not drinking too much. That they were lawless, and that they instituted the English legal code that, so they thought, closely and uniquely followed Hebrew law. That Anglo-Saxons were ferocious in battle, thinking of the Vikings, and that they were consistently destroyed in war. That they had stayed together as a people and avoided intermarriage, and at the same time that they scattered throughout Europe or the world and had intermarried so as to completely lose their ethnicity, and so on, really, with hundreds of proofs like these. Lesson 26, The Sagas and Civilizations of Scandinavia, relied on 11th to 13th century Icelandic Eddas and sagas that set down a mix of long-held oral traditions and new fictional stories that became the Scandinavian mythology. The Origin of the Frank section displayed the three-step intellectual dance of how society authors, including Smith in The Way to Perfection, commonly used as evidence historical traditions that were widely considered by mainstream historians to be of suspect origin or clearly fictional. We also saw this in Reynolds' Are We of Israel? First, the article acknowledged there are questions as to the source's veracity, though it was also common for authors to skip that step. But here, quote, these pedigrees are so ancient it is impossible to test their accuracy from historical facts, but according to the legends. Second, the article presents evidence from the suspect source. In this case, it's a legend of a 4th century BC son of a, quote, chief prince of Ephraim, whose people were expelled by the Goths from their home at the mouth of the Danube. A portion of them are rumored to migrate to Holland and the Netherlands. Third, the article draws a firm conclusion that no longer carries any hesitancy. Quote, this makes it evident that the Frankish or Germanic nations also have an Israelitish origin. There are many examples of this laundering of bad history in Birthright Blessings, and multiple in this chapter. I've run across dozens of examples in the writings of the Society leaders. There may be hundreds. The book sections, the Ynglinga Saga and Norse and Anglo-Saxon genealogies, recount portions of the Snorri Sturlason 13th century tale of Odin and his son Skjold. Snorri sagas are the chief source of popular Norse mythology and contain, well, they consist entirely of stories like you see in Marvel Comics superhero movies starring Odin, Loki, and Thor. But in the 13th century version, they are much less believable. Seriously, much less believable. With tales of how Odin and his fellow gods use magical powers to usually achieve success in mating or conflicts with frost giants, dwarfs, blue men, wolves, dragons, serpents, and strange beasts. The Birthright Blessings author snatches from the tales just what is needed to deduce a line of lineage from the Israelites to the Norse kings to the 20th century Utah Saints. Lesson 26 ends with the conclusion that, quote, even if, in after years, Odin was deified by the Norse and worshipped as a god, the most authentic of these genealogies indicated that he was actually a real personage as shown by the sagas. This is at least the 5th time I've seen Odin appear in a Society publication. The first 2 were in the magazine in 1915, though the second of those hedged that Odin's historicity was not well established. By 1934, prominent Society members were writing with conviction that Odin was, quote, a great Ephraimitic king, and that his direct sons were rulers of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Russia, and that practically all members of the church were descended from Odin. As a direct result of these Society magazine articles, Odin and some of his family, most often Frigg, Skjold, and Baldeg, started showing up on Mormon family trees, likely as genealogy class members completed lesson assignments and stored them in their books of remembrance. Lesson 27, Who are the Anglo-Saxons?, begins on the page shown on this slide. The accompanying photo is of a statue of Odin. The lesson concludes, quote, we should all be proud of our Anglo-Saxon descent, because it proves that we too are children of the covenant. Beyond the genealogy books, lesson manuals, and articles published by the Society, Society leaders also published lineage books with the Church's Deseret Printing House or with independent publishers. A prominent example published by Deseret Book was Apostle and Society President Anthony Ivan's intentionally fictional 1931 eugenics novel, Her Mother's Daughter. Another, and one of the most jarring works of LDS literature, was James H. Anderson's God's Covenant Race, published in 1937, reprinted in 38, 44, and 46. Anderson was a founder and original director of the Society. He was also executive secretary for 40 years, from 1894 to 1934. Shortly before he died in 1934, Deseret published a 650-page collection of his sermons and writings. God's Covenant Race contains 240 of those pages that center on lineage. From the book cover showing the covenant race as a crowd of light-skinned people, to its strong teachings of racial purity, racial identity, and racial destiny, it is an extreme source of lineage teachings. In addition to Anderson's writings, the book includes full copies of articles from the contemporary British Israel magazine, Destiny. The book was first published in 1937 with 35 pages of Destiny articles. In the second and later editions, it reprinted 120 pages from the Destiny articles, most by William Cameron, who in the 1930s was president of the American Anglo-Saxon Federation and, oddly, one of America's most well-known anti-Semites. In the late 1920s, he went to trial in a nationally publicized libel suit after the newspaper he edited, Henry Ford's The Dearborn Independent, published multiple alt-right anti-Semitic articles and popularized the 1920s hit anti-Semitic fraud, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. God's Covenant Race appears to have been prepared as a lesson manual, as it contains study questions at the back of chapters. I have found Society lesson outlines that refer to the book, but haven't verified that it was used as a primary lesson text, other than that many copies I've seen include a note that appears to accompany the book as a gift to missionaries as a study guide. As an interesting side note, in the book, Anderson claims Mormons started the British Israelism movement through the Church's 1830s missionary work in England, which preceded publication of the first British Israelism book, John Wilson's 1840 Our Israelitish Origin. Apostle and Society Director John Widstow positively reviewed the book in a 1938 Improvement Era article. Of Anderson's British Israel claims, Widstow wrote, "The historical tracing of the lost tribes of Israel is very interesting and instructive," though he also wrote, "The author's leaning toward the British Israel movement must be looked upon as a personal opinion." He did chide the author for not teaching that all peoples could be adopted into Israel. He concluded the short review with an endorsement. Quote, "The essence of the volume is the discussion of fundamental views of the Church by one of ripened understanding. A full and intelligent faith in the divinity of the work established through Joseph Smith pervades every page of the volume." The astute observer may notice after close inspection some difference between the ethnicity of the people shown as God's Covenant Race in 1938 versus those shown in the Church's program handout for the 2018 B1 event held at the LDS Conference Center to commemorate the 40-year anniversary of ending the exclusions of people with Black African ancestry. In the first half of the 20th century, the Genealogical Society of Utah was the principal source of the nourishing, the theological fertilizer that was laid down, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, to reify Mormon lineage beliefs. For those early to mid-20th century Mormons, for at least the decades of the 1930s and 40s, they were taught year after year in multiple types of classes on multiple days of the week in multiple venues that Scripture and the overwhelming mass of evidence from the fields of archaeology, anthropology, zoology, history, linguistics, especially philology, semiotics, government, law, and religion confirmed that the saints were principally descendants of the Israelites, uniquely so compared to the rest of the world. I suggest that without the cavalcade of teachings of Mormon Israelism that we've seen from the Society, the practice of restricting black members from full membership in the Church in heaven, the principal apostasy of this dispensation, could not have been maintained beyond the mid-20th century. It likely would have disappeared decades earlier than it did. In fact, If we allow the pleasure of counterfactual daydreaming, I believe if we could excise a single book of lineage teachings from the Mormon past, the Society's lesson manual, The Way to Perfection, written by Joseph Fielding Smith, if we could excise that book, all other things being equal, the lineage restrictions wouldn't have lasted out of the 1950s, and perhaps not beyond the 40s. Well, so, thinking back on this presentation, if concepts of tribe and race are social constructions based on history, biology, and ancestry, what happens when you get all three of those wrong? And if the idea and meaning of being divinely chosen by the God of the Hebrews is a matter of scriptural interpretation and theology, what happens when you get both of those wrong? With our teachings of Mormons as literal Ephraimites uniquely chosen by God, and black Africans as cursed by God, we Mormons simultaneously got all of the above wrong: human history, biology, ancestry, scripture, and theology. We are an American religion, so many of our mistakes can be explained in significant part as our codification of an American racist culture that was forged in significant part by a desire to justify slavery and segregation, and to justify the theft of lands from and mass killings of Native peoples, all at a time when the Old Testament stories in Genesis were thought to be an accurate historical record of the creation and spread of humans. But then the follow-up question is, why did we hold, or in some cases, why do we continue to hold these mistaken beliefs so close for so long after that culture changed significantly and after supporting evidences for the beliefs faded? Especially given that you could completely remove the doctrine of chosen lineage from Mormon theology, as many Mormons have, and lose nothing, and require no change except that patriarchal blessings would either have different content or be interpreted differently. What does this say about our epistemology as a community, our ways of learning? What does this suggest about our future ability to correct current erroneous beliefs or practices? For myself, the preceding presentation is really an introduction, a foreground to these questions, and this is where the discussion gets interesting, although that's part 4 of the presentation, which is a discussion for another day. That's the end of this presentation. This is an expanded version of one I delivered during the July 2018 Sunstone panel called The Chosen Seed, Reexamining Mormon Conceptions of Race and Lineage 40 Years After Official Declaration 2. My co-panelists there were Matthew Harris and Newell Bringhurst. The elders of Israel come join now with me and seek out the righteous where'er they may be. In desert, on mountain, on land, or on sea, and bring them to Zion, the pure and the free. If we were in a room together now, we'd likely engage in a question and answer session. In that spirit, let me pose a few follow-up questions of my own. For some, I suggest briefly a direction for an answer. For others, I just present the question. Question 1. What did early to mid-20th century Mormons mean when they claimed they were of the blood of Israel, or the pure blood of Ephraim? Authors of this time period applied the concept of blood lineage and how or when to claim a specific lineage or inheritance in very contradictory ways, and it's difficult to weave together a logical supporting framework. There's much to say in answer to this question, but I'll just note that as background for the mishmash of our thinking on this issue, the claims of Mormon Israelism, including the concepts of pure blood and, quote, believing blood, which was thought to make one more likely to accept the gospel, were developed in the 1800s before people were aware of Mendelian genetics, and they could not have an understanding of natural selection or knowledge of the genes or the structure of DNA, the mechanisms by which organisms pass their traits to their descendants. Our 20th century Genealogical Society authors were in a somewhat different position, as much more was known about genetics, not what we know today, but much more. But to take Joseph Fielding Smith as an example, he was born in 1876, didn't have much formal schooling, and finished what schooling he did have early enough that he developed his opinions on lineage and race before he could have become aware of the new scientific developments. And then beginning in about 1910 and for the rest of his life, Smith famously and aggressively and effectively battled some of the new developing consensuses in various scientific fields regarding human history and migrations. Question 2. Did beliefs in Mormon Israelism have any positive outcomes? Multiple authors have argued in recent years that the teachings of Mormon Israelism have had beneficial roles in the development of the church. I don't understand the arguments well enough yet to explain them here. I need to pay more attention to that. I will pay more attention to that. But here is my attempt at passing on the main arguments I'm aware of. First, being identified as specially chosen imbues people with a sense of special purpose and motivates members to extra service. An example of this may be that Mormons felt called to do missionary work as one of the assignments given to Ephraim's tribe. It would seem that this claim could be tested against our own history and by comparing our history to Christian denominations without Israelism. Does our self-designated chosenness lead to greater works? The second argument I think I see is that because God's blessings to Abraham and Israel were granted to a relatively narrow number of humans, the doctrines of Mormon Israelism are thought to be a blessing because they show how through adoption God chooses to share those initially limited blessings with a wider portion of humanity. Although I think this misinterprets Scripture and wrongly assumes an initial exclusivist position. Question 3. Have Mormon Israelism beliefs caused harm within or without our culture, or have they been benign? A very partial answer is that, first, the teachings were an important part of the theological support for excluding people with black African ancestry. And then, when the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s posed the public policy questions of whether racial segregation was ethical and whether it ought to be legal for a government to mandate or fund segregation, we used our mythic and theological resources to justify the segregated status quo. And those resources were principally the detailed teachings and claims of Mormon Israelism. And that seems to me to be a tragic rejection of the creative, radical spirit of Christianity and the early Mormons. Question 4. In creating and maintaining an Ephraimite identity for light-skinned saints with a European background, how did we draw from cultural white supremacy within the United States? Question 5. What differences and similarities are there between our efforts to establish a white Ephraimite identity for the saints and the racism of the Christian identity movement? There is some similarity, especially during the mid-20th century, as both movements discovered themselves to be favored Israelites at the top of a racial hierarchy, and both encouraged racial segregation. However, there is much less overlap than the previous sentence suggests. In the western U.S., the most prominent example of Christian identity was the Aryan Nations organization founded by Richard Butler and located in northern Idaho, along with his Church of Jesus Christ Christian. I interviewed Butler in 1987 while writing an article for the Student Review about student protests over the Aryan Nations' planned incursion into Ogden, Utah. Unfortunately, I didn't have the theological chops to explore the influence of British Israelism on his church or the Christian identity movement, and didn't ask about that. But based on Michael Barkin's book, Religion and the Racist Right, and Douglas Cohen's article on Constructing Christian Identity, my brief answer to this question is that Mormon Israelism had two overlapping elements with Christian identity, and then some very strong differences. The main similarity was the assumption that light-skinned Northern Europeans were Israelites uniquely descended from the Lost 10 Tribes, along with the unchristian conclusion that this group was favored by God. Though Mormon Israelism, unlike Christian identity, did offer a means for most other peoples, not all, to be adopted into the favored tribe. And both organizations put their Israelism to work as theological support for racial segregation, though within Mormonism that was a temporary practice that largely followed the rise and fall of pro-segregation sentiments of the majority of white Americans. In contrast, racial segregation is a key continuing and violent component of Christian identity theology and practice. Mormon Israelism didn't and doesn't share any of the following concepts that are key to Christian identity. With the Christian identity movement, Adam and Eve are thought to be the parents of only white European peoples. The serpent in the garden is Satan or his representative, and Eve's sin is a sexual relationship with the serpent that produced the child Cain, from whom Christian identity adherents claim Jews are descended. All other non-European peoples are assumed to be descended from pre-Adamic peoples completely unrelated to Adam. Question 6. Is there correlation and is there causation between A, holding a restrictive view of salvation, and B, the ability to believe that God chose to favor certain lineages and curse others? First, I think there is a strong correlation, but I have to first complete more analytical work before comfortably making that claim. Then I may be able to profitably explore causality. It makes sense to me that there would be a causal relation, and I think I see that in the authors of Mormon Israelism, but I'm not in a position to draw any conclusions. Question 7. I suggest in the presentation that Joseph Fielding Smith and the book The Way to Perfection had a specific impact on the George Albert Smith First Presidency's view of the racial exclusions in the late 1940s. What are the supporting details for that claim? There are multiple. I'll just mention now that in a 1948 letter to someone questioning the racial exclusions, the First Presidency quoted from The Way to Perfection and directed the recipient to 4 different locations of the book for support for the exclusions. When this letter was written, over the prior 17 years, The Way had been used through at least 4 sets of 2-year lesson cycles. Without that background, the First Presidency, which included J. Reuben Clark and David O. McKay, may have answered differently. Question 8. Would there be any detriment to expressly ending a belief in literal Israelism? Perhaps by simply stating, we now fully believe the statement that all are alike unto God in the Book of Mormon, or that God is no respecter of persons in the New Testament, and that there is no divinely favored lineage? Question 9. Is Mormon Israelism truly dying out among church members? Yes, as judged by the volume of church lessons and publications that make literal lineage claims, and the increase in references to Abrahamic blessings as being available to all. However, with the current First Presidency, one could imagine a minor resurgence. From more than one statement over the last couple of years, President Nilsson seems to be aligned in some ways with Joseph Fielding Smith's more restrictive salvation theology, and President Nilsson previously has shown an affinity for Mormon Israelism. He was born in 1924, so was in his teens and 20s at the height of the era of lineage teachings. This slide shows sermons he gave in 1988 and 1995 with Mormon Israelism content. In 1988, at a BYU devotional, he asks, "Are you Hebrew? Yes. You are related to Abraham. Most of us are of the lineage of Joseph through Ephraim or Manasseh. What does this ancient history have to do with you and your identity? It has everything to do with your identity. It also relates to the direction your lives may take, your choices, your challenges. It should influence your selection of your partner in marriage." Then, in a General Conference sermon in 1995, he said, "Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are our ancestors. We are of Israel. We have the right to receive the gospel, blessings of the priesthood, and eternal life." Question 10. Do we have a responsibility as a community to do more to excise these beliefs and teachings now? Question 11. Should we formally repudiate the past Israelism teachings as contradictory to our present understandings of Scripture and Gospel, and as contradicted by the historical record? Question 12. Should we stop the practice of designating an Israelite lineage in patriarchal blessings? Question 13. Should we modify scriptures that continue to teach inaccurate lineage beliefs, such as the Book of Mormon stories explaining darker skin color as a curse for sin? These are the last questions and the last slide. Question 14. Given the latest information available about human migrations and the consequent increasingly sophisticated modeling of human ancestry, I'm thinking in particular of Rode, Olson, and Chang's 2004 article on ancestry modeling in the journal Nature and the responses to it, it appears now that it is reasonably likely all humans living today are direct descendants of many hundreds of thousands of people who lived in the Abrahamic era, people of that time who lived in the Middle East, and Asia, and Africa, and Europe, among other places. How should this change how we think about our past lineage teachings? Question 15. As a follow-up, did our Mormon genealogists, who were deep into ancestral models themselves 80 and 100 years ago, have a sense of how common and recent our shared ancestry is? From multiple statements in the Society's publications over the years, and at least one detailed article discussing the math behind calculating our most recent common ancestors, it seems that some of the staff and authors did have a good understanding of this concept. That's the end of this question and answer section and the end of the presentation.